We know enough about EQs to be able to say things like, okay, so if I wanted to, let's just say, add high frequency content to this, or increase, actually not add, but increase the level of high frequency content to this, I can come in over here and kind of boost that this way. Or if I wanted to reduce the low end. But not every EQ is cut out to be the same. So let's just go through some of these already. And I'm going to show you kind of what's the differences between them, and we're going to do some ear training. The best tip, the best bit of advice that I can give you right now is this. These are the three things that I was taught a long time ago from Bob Katz, which is this. It's if you have nonlinear phase EQs, shift focus. They actually move things forward or backward within a mix. So if I wanted to, let's say, take a vocal down in a master, right? If I wanted to turn the vocal down, I would use a linear phase EQ. I would come in here this way. I would find the vocal. Let's find it real quick. See him in here. I'm going to turn off max. We're going to go to medium because it's just too much latency. So I can pull him off here. And all I'm doing is taking energy out of that vocal. I'm not shifting its focus in the mix. I'm not pushing it forward or backward. But if I wanted to, let's say, take that same energy off the vocal, but instead shift it forward or backward in the mix, I would use a nonlinear phase EQ for that. Here he goes backwards. So the difference between, let's say, this and that, let's come off here like this. So we have this here, which is our just taking energy out of the vocal. Here it's a little bit more like, let's say, like that mid body is kind of missing. But this one is backwards in the mix. Sounds further away. So you can hear it's just like the linear phase is only taking energy out. And the nonlinear phase is actually shifting focus. And the reason for that is the phase differential. Our ears, our hearing is based upon phase. Like if, and we use, that's phase is what we use for location data. It's to say that like, so there's timing differences that we use to locate information, and there's phase. And so when a sound happens from, let's say, one side and comes at us and from only from that side, of course it's going to hit this ear earlier than it'll hit this ear. But also there will be a phase differential at what period it will be at in that cycle by the time it hits this ear. And our brain knows that and does those calculations and turns that into location data. And so when we know that, okay, so nonlinear phase EQs will actually help us shift focus, we can use those to add focus. In fact, if you were watching the approach, the mastering section where we start to add height, we use a phase differential to create our height. We actually create phase differentials in the high frequency content, and by removing the frequencies with nonlinear phase and then boosting them, or removing them with linear phase and then boosting them with nonlinear phase, we get this phase differential at the crossover. And that actually changes the focus, and that gives us this height. It's all artificial, right? The speakers are not coming any higher up. We didn't move any sound sources higher up. It has to be artificial. And so by creating those small phase differentials, you can create artificial focus. And your brain will actually interpret that as being differentials within space rather than just differentials within frequency. Does that make sense, children? Let me show you exactly these phase differentials that I'm talking about right now. Let's bring in a massive real quick. I don't even need to hear the output on this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send it to another audio track and record it so you can see the waveforms. So I'm setting this one to the massive. And now I can record it. All right, so we should be able to see here what we're talking about in the phase. So this is just a little bit of a... You'll see this thing changing in phase here, right? Because, of course, the massive is not set to restart via gate. So I need to set that up first. Boom. Oh, it's actually over here. Boom. And then I'm going to set this to a pure sine wave so that it's going to be much easier to see. Oh, and I want to make sure there is no envelope on this so we can really just see what's going on here. we should always be seeing this thing starting this way, right? We have our initial positive zero crossing. That's what we want to see, children. We want to see this thing always developing like this. But if I start to apply EQs and more importantly filtering, you'll start to see this thing shift. So I'm not sure if I can do this in real time without it actually overwriting because Ableton is bizarre. No, it's working. Okay, cool. This is great. So there's our frequency. I'm going to now take here. Now I have an EQ8, or not an EQ8. I have a FabFilter Pro Q2 on here, and I'm going to start to filter. So if I go to low cut, and it's nonlinear phase, what you're going to watch down here is the phase differential changing. You're going to see this thing moving in phase as I get closer and closer and closer to the cutoff. And specifically, as we get steeper and steeper and steeper in our filtering. See this shift down into potentially even phase inverted. So you can see this thing now, the phase is completely different. I'm not at the frequency that we're playing. We're not near the frequency. And if I wanted to, in fact, let me go in here to make it a little bit more overt because we're just applying those fades. That's making it a little hard to see what's really going on here. So let me turn that off and let me pull this over here. And now let's see if we can get this thing to work a little bit easier. There we go. So you can see now when this thing triggers, as I pull this away, you should see the phase coming back to more natural phase, that positive zero crossing. See that? And the closer I get, the more that phase begins to shift. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about filtering things. See that? See, I'm nowhere near I'm nowhere near the frequency, but you can see this first positive zero crossing beginning to shift to just being actually a negative crossing the closer I get. And if we really want to zoom that in, you can really see here, let's just get that huge, big as we can get it. So you can really see that change. It begins to shift the incident. It begins to change whether or not it's making this frequency push forward or backwards. See? See? Like, I'm hundreds of hertz away from the frequency, but yet I'm shifting its phase just by getting closer and closer and closer to it this way. So even without even listening to it, you can see the effects of nonlinear phase. Whereas if I switch this to linear phase, we shouldn't have any of those changes. It's going to take a second to reload. Is it not recording anymore? Where did the recording go? Oh, it's late. There's your latency. Yeah, and there's our positive zero crossing. Yeah, there's our positive zero crossing again. It's latent. Oh, but you get the other ramifications, right? So this is great. This is absolutely fantastic. So while we're sitting here looking at this stuff, and I understand it's like, wait, we're doing audio, but we're just using our eyes now. It's important to understand what these artifacts are. So do you notice this strange sort of zero cross that then goes down into actual like negative before it jumps up? That's an effect called pre-ring. And it's an artifact of the math of the linear phase. Like, not only is the pre-ring happening, but you can see the amount of latency that's being created by it going into linear phase. So you can see the math in real time. You can say it's getting latent, and not only is it getting latent, and it probably will be fine if I stopped it. Maybe we can get this latency to be removed if we're stopping it. Yeah, there we go. See? Ableton can't do the math when we switch it. It'll do the math if we stop, and there you go. So now we're over here. Now I can get as close to this as I want, and we're not going to change that. See? No adjustments at all when it comes to the actual first positive zero crossing. It's just sitting there just fine. Now, remember that pre-ring I talked about, right? So pre-ring is the other artifacts you get from linear phase. And what it can do is make transient response be less active, because the speakers are actually, it's like, these are all voltages. Everything that we're seeing here, these are voltages. So This here at the exact 0 line is now saying speakers move not at all, no voltage, okay? But if I begin to get this thing closer and closer and closer to this, even in linear phase mode, watch that line actually dip below the 0 line. You'll see it come in here. Oh, we're not recording. Hang on a second. Boom, boom. You see that? So I'm filtering with this linear phase EQ here, and the information that's being sent to the speakers, the actual control voltages, is saying speakers pull back a little bit. Actually come off of your 0 point, which changes, like it's actually saying like turn down, right? Like that will turn into a volume decrease across the board because you're now saying to your speakers, change the amount. You're not moving forward and backward anymore, pulsing and undulating, creating frequencies. You're just now reducing the range. It's like DC offset. You're now just reducing the range of the speaker, of the actual amount of excursion that the speaker can produce. And this is a classic problem with linear phase EQs, is there's always this trade-off. And that's why people say, they're like, is one better? Should I always be using linear? I switched out all my EQs for linear phase EQs. And you're like, great. You killed your transient response and you're not working on your focus. And you might need linear phase EQs because if it's in nonlinear phase mode, you're nuking, potentially, if you're filtering really hard, you're modifying that phase response. It's nearly 180 degrees out of phase at this point if it's in nonlinear phase mode. You see that? That's crazy. I'm nowhere near the frequency, and the further away I get, the more that phase response comes back to normal. But the only way I get it all the way back to normal is if I turn the EQ off. Then you can really see that actual arc take shape. See that? Pull it down. Takes off that, see that last little edge right off that first positive 0 crossing? I'm filtering at 10 hertz in nonlinear phase mode, but I'm changing the phase relationship of that see? Different response. And so that should be a visual, there's your visual representation of what's happening within these EQs when you do work, is that you are actually changing how the waveforms are being produced, and whether or not they're positive 0 or they're negative 0 crossing is the initial event. And by understanding that, and by understanding that actually, yes, I understand, like, it was difficult to hear, like, the volumes were weird and I'm on the wrong screen, and so skip me. Don't use my examples. But you can see now that this is actually shifting phase, or it's creating pre-ring. And the pre-ring is going to play with your transient response, and the shift in phase is going to change your depth. And it could even create phase differentials. Like you might have, this is one of the reasons why, like, if I'm filtering basses that need to sit with subs, often I will use linear phase to do that filtering. If I'm at all worried about the phase relationship between those two elements, I will absolutely use linear phase. And I will deal with the lack of transient response that I've created due to the pre-ring and the linear phase EQ on the bass tops to have the phase relationship be correct, because I'd rather have a little bit of a lack of transient response, whereas I would definitely not want the phase, the subtops and the sub to phase out, right? Like it's just understanding the problems that are being created.